Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read another uh, stanza by Edgar Allan Poe. It's called King Pest. About 12 o'clock one night in the month of October, and during the chivalrous reign of the third Edward, two seamen belonging to the crew of the Free and Easy, a trading schooner plying between Sluss and the Thames and an anchor in the river, were much astonished to find themselves seated in the tap room of the alehouse of the parish of St. Andrews, London, which alehouse bore for sign the portraiture of the Jolly Tar. The room, although ill-contrived, smoke-blackened, low-pitched, and in every other respect agreeing with the general character of such places at the period, were nevertheless, in the opinion of the grotesque groups scattered here and there within it, sufficiently well adapted to its purpose. Of these groups are two seamen formed. I think most interesting is not the most conspicuous. Of one of them appeared to be the elder, and whom his companion addressed by the characteristic appellation of Legs, was at the same time much the taller of the two. He might have measured 6 feet and a half, and the habitual stoop in the shoulders seemed to have been the necessary consequence of an altitude so enormous. Superfluous in heights were, however, more than accompanied by deficiencies in other respects. He was exceedingly thin, and might, as his associates asserted, have answered when drunk for a permanent at the masthead, or when sober have served for a jib boom. But these jests and others of the similar nature had evidently produced at no time an effect upon the chicanery muscles of the tar. With high cheekbones and a large hawk nose, retreating chin, fallen under jaw, and huge protruding white eyes, and expressions of his countenance, although tinged with a species of dogged indifference to matters and things in general, was not the less utterly solemn and serious beyond all attempts at imagination or description. The younger seaman was, in all outward appearance, the converse of the companion. His stature could not have exceeded 4 feet. A pair of stumpy bow legs supported his squat, unwieldy feature, which his unusually short and thick arms, with no ordinary fists at their extremities, swung off dangling from the sides like the fins of a sea turtle. Small eyes of no particular color twinkled far back in his head. His nose remained buried in a mass of flesh which enveloped his round, full, and purple face, and his thick upper lip rested upon the still thicker one beneath an air of complacent self-satisfaction, most heightened by the owner's habit of licking them at intervals. He evidently regarded his tall shipmate with a feeling of half wondrous, half quizzical, and stared up occasionally at his face as the red setting sun stares up at the crags of Nevis Bevis. Various and eventful, however, had been the peregrinations of the worthy couple in and about the different tap houses of the neighborhood during the early hours of the night. Funds, even the most ample, were not always everlasting, and it was with every empty pockets our friends had ventured upon the present hostelry. As the precise period, then, when this history properly commences, Legs and his fellow, Hugh Tarpaulin, sat, each with both elbows resting upon the large oaken table in the middle of the floor, with a hand upon either cheek. They were eyeing from behind a huge flagon of unpaid-for humming stuff for portentous words, no chalk, which to their indignation and astonishment were scored over the doorway by means of the very mineral where its presence was purported to deny. Not that the gift was deciphering written in characters, a gift among the commonality of the day, considered little less cabalistical than the art of inditing, could in strict justice have been laid to the charge of either disciple of the sea, but there was, to say the truth, a certain twist in the formation of the letters, an indescribable lee lurch about the whole, which forebodied the opinion of both seamen, a long run of dirty weather, and determined once at them, in the allegorical words of Legg himself, to chew up a sail and scud before the wind. Having accordingly disposed of what remained of the ale and looped up the points of their short doublets, they finally made a bolt for the street. Although Terrapin rolled twice upon the fireplace, making it for the door, yet their escape was a lengthy, happy effected, and half after 12 o'clock found their heroes ripe with mischief and running for life down a dark alley in the direction of St. Andrew's Stair, hotly pursued by the landlady of the Jolly Tar. At the epoch of the eventful tale, and periodically for many years before and after, all England, but more especially the metropolis, resounded with the fearful cry of plague. The city was in great measure depopulated, and in this horrible regions, in the vicinity of the Thames, where amid the dark, narrow, and filthy lanes and alleys, the demons of disease was supported to have had his nativity. Awe, terror, and superstition were alone to be found stalking around. My authority of the king, such districts were placed under ban, and all persons forbidden, under pain of death, to intrude into their dismal solitude. Yet neither of the mandate of the monarch nor the huge barriers entered the entrances of the streets, nor the prospect of the lonesome death, which was almost absolutely certain, overwhelmed the wretch, whom no peril could deter from the adventure, prevented the unfurnished and untenanted dwellings from being stripped by the hand of nightly rapine of every article, such as iron, brass, or lead work, which could in any manner be turned into a profitable account. Above all, it is usually found upon the annual winter opening of the barriers that locks, bolts, and secret cellars have been proved but slender protection to those rich stories of wines and liqueurs, which in consideration of the risk and trouble of removal, many of the numerous dealers have shopped in the neighborhood, had consented to trust during the period of exile to so insufficient a security. But there was very few of the terror-stricken people who attributed these doings to the agency of human hands. Pest spirits, plague goblins, and fever demons were the popular imps of mischief, and tales so blood-chilling they're hourly told that the whole mass of forbidden buildings was at length enveloped in terror as in a shroud, and the plunderer himself was often scared away by the arrows of his own depredations had created, leaving the entire vast circuit a prohibited district of gloom, silence, and pestilence and death. It was by one of the terrific barriers already mentioned, and which indicated the region beyond to be under the pest ban, that in scrambling down an alley, Legs and the worthy Hugh Tarpaulin found this progress suddenly impeded. To return to out of the question, and no time was to be lost, but their pursuers were close upon their heels, while thoroughbred seamen to clamber up the roughly fashioned plank work was a trifle, and maddened with the twofold excitement of exercise and liquor, they leaped unhesitatingly down within the enclosure, and holding on their drunken course with shouts and yellings, had soon bewildered its noisome and intricate recesses. Had they not indeed been intoxicated beyond moral sense, their reeling footsteps must have been palsied by the horrors of the situation. The air was cold and misty. The paving stones, loosened from their beds, lay in wild disorder amid the tall, ranking grass which sprang up around their feet and ankles. Fallen houses choked up the streets. The most fetid and poisonous smells everywhere prevailed, and by the aid of that ghastly light which, even at midnight, never fails to emanate from the vapory and pestilentially atmosphere, might be discerned lying in the bypaths and alleys of rotting in the windowless habitations the carcasses of many a nocturnal plunderer arrested by the hand of the plague in the very perpetration of his robbery. But it lay not in the power of images or sensations or impediments such as these to stay the course of men who naturally brave and at the same time especially brimful of courage and of humming stuff would have reeled as straight as their condition might have permitted undauntedly into the very jaws of death. Onward, still onward, stalked the grim Legs, making the desolate solemnity echo and re-echo with yells like a terrific war whoop of an Indian. And onward, still onward, rolled the dumpy Tarpaulin, hanging on to the doublet of his more active companion, far surpassing the latter's most strenuous exertions in the way of vocal music, by bull roaring in basso from the profundity of the stentorian lungs. They had now evidently reached the stronghold of the pestilence. Their way at every step or plunge grew more noisome and more horrible, the paths more narrow and more intricate, huge stones and beams falling momentarily from the decaying roofs above them gave evidence of their sullen and heavy descent, of the vast height of the surrounding houses, and while actual exertion became necessary to force a massive through frequent heaps of rubbish, it was by no means seldom that the hand fell upon the skeleton or rested upon a more fleshy corpse. Suddenly, as the seaman stumbled against the entrance of the hall and ghastly-looking building, a yell more than usually shrill about the throat of the excited legs was replied to from within in a rapid succession of wild laughter-like and fiendish shrieks, nothing daunted at sounds which, of such a nature and at such time and in such a place, might have curdled the very blood in hearts less irrevocably on fire. The drunken couple rushed headlong against the door, burst it open, and staggered into the midst of things with a volley of curses. The room within, which was found themselves, proved to be the shop of an undertaker, but an open trap door in the corner of the floor near the entrance looked down upon a long range of wine cellars, whose steps the occasional sound of bursting bottles proclaimed to be well stored with the appropriate contents. In the middle of the room stood a table, in the center of which again rose a huge tub, of which appeared to be punch, bottles of various wines and cordials, together with jugs, pitchers, and flagons in every shape and quality, were scattered profusely upon the board. Upon it, upon coffin trestles, were seated a company of 6. The company I will endeavor to delineate one by one. Fronting the entrance, the elevated a little above his companions, sat a personage who appeared to be the president of the table. His stature was gaunt and tall, and legs was confounded to behold in him the figure most emaciated than himself. His face was as yellow as saffron, but no feature, excepting one alone and sufficiently marked to merit a particular description. This one considered in a forehead so unusually and hideously lofty that he had the appearance of a bonnet or crown of flesh superadded upon the natural head. His mouth was puckered and dimpled into an expression of ghastly affability, and his eyes, as indeed the eyes of all at table, were glazed over in the fumes of intoxication. The gentleman was clothed from the head to foot in a richly embroidered black silver velvet pall wrapped negligently around his form after the fashion of the Spanish cloak. His head was stuck full of sable hearse plumes, which he nodded to and fro with a jaunty and knowing air, and in his right hand he held a huge human thigh bone, with which he appeared to have been just knocking down some members of the company for a song. Opposite him, and with her back to the door, was a lady of no whit less extraordinary character. Although quite as tall as the person just described, she had no right to complain about the unnatural emaciation. She was evidently in the last stage of a dropsy, and her figure resembled nearly that of a huge puncheon of October beer, which stood with the head driven in close by her side in a corner of the chamber. Her face was exceedingly round, red, and full, and the same peculiarity, or rather want of peculiarity, attached herself to her countenance, which I before mentioned in the case of the president. That is to say, only one feature of her face was sufficiently distinguished to need a separate characterization. Indeed, the acute tarpaulin immediately observed that the same remark might have applied to each individual person of the party, every one of whom seemed to possess a monopoly of some similar proportion of physiognomy. With the lady in question, this proportion proved to be the mouth. Commencing at the right ear, it swept with a terrific chasm to the left, a short pendant with which she wore an either auricle continually bobbing into the aperture. She made, however, every exertion to keep her mouth closed and look dignified, in a dress consisting of a newly starched and iron shroud coming up close under her chin with a crumpled rifle of cambric muslin. In her right hand sat a diminutive young lady whom she appeared to patronize. This delicate little creature, in the trembling of her wasted fingers, in the livid hue of her lips, and the slight hectic spot which tinged her otherwise leaden complexion, gave evident indications of a galloping consumption. The air of extreme haute ton, however, pervaded her whole appearance. She wore in a graceful and dégaî manner a large and beautiful wind sheet of the finest India lawn. Her hair hung in ringlets over her neck, a soft smile played about her mouth, but her nose, extremely long, thin, sinuous, flexible, and pimpled, hung down far below her underlip, and in spite of the delicate manner in which she now and then moved it to the one side and the other with her tongue, gave to her countenance a somewhat unequivocal expression. Over against her and upon the left of her dropsical lady was seated a little puffy, wheezing, and gouty old man, whose cheeks reposed upon the shoulders of their owner like two huge bladders of Obtoro wine. With his arms folded and with the bandaged leg deposited upon the table, he seemed to think himself entitled to some consideration. He had evidently prided himself upon every inch of his personal appearance, but took more especial delight in calling attention to his gaudy colored surtout. This, to say the truth, must have cost him no little money, and was made to fit him exceedingly well, being fashioned from one of the curiously embroidered silken covers appertaining to those glorious escutcheons which in England and elsewhere are customarily hung up in some conspicuous place upon the dwellings of departed aristocracy. Next to him, at the right hand of the president, was a gentleman in long white hose and cotton drawers. His frame shook in a ridiculous manner with a fit of what Tarpaulin called the horrors. His jaws, which had been newly shaved, were tightly tied up by a bandage of muslin, and his arms, being fastened in a similar way at the wrist, prevented him from helping himself too freely to the liquors upon the table, a precaution rendered necessary in the opinion of Legs by the peculiarly sottish and wine-bibbing cast of his visage, a pair of prodigious ears, nevertheless, which it was no doubt found impossible to confine, towered away into the atmosphere of the apartment, and were occasionally pricked up in a spasm of the sound of a drawing of a cork. Fronting him, sixthly and lastly, was situated a singularly stiff-looking personage who, being afflicted by paralysis, must, to speak seriously, have felt very ill at ease of his unaccommodating habiliments. He was habited, somewhat uniquely, in a new and handsome mahogany coffin, its top or headpiece pressed up against the skull of the wearer and extended over it in the fashion of a hood, giving to the entire face an air and indescribable interest. Armholes had been cut into the sides for the sake of more of elegance than of convenience, but the dress nevertheless prevented its proprietor from sitting as erect as his associates, and as he lay reclining against his trestle at an angle of 45 degrees, a pair of huge goggle eyes rolled out upon their awful whites towards the ceiling in absolute amazement of their own enormity. Before each of the party lay a portion of a skull which was used as a drinking cup. Overhead was suspended a human skeleton by means of a rope tied around one of the legs and fastened to a ring in the ceiling. The other limb, confined to no such fetter, struck off from the body at right angles, causing the whole loose and rattling frame to dangle and twirl about in the caprice of every occasional puff of wind which found its way into the apartment. On the cranium of this hideous thing lay a quantity of ignited charcoal, with which a fitful but vivid light over the entire scene, while coffins and other wares appertaining to the shop of the undertaker, while piled high up around the room and against the windows, preventing any ray from escaping into the street. At sight of the extraordinary assembly and of their still more exaggerating paraphernalia, our two seamen did not conduct themselves with the degree of decorum that might have been expected. Legs, leaning against the wall near which he happened to be standing, dropped his lower jaw, then lower than usual, and spreading open his eyes to the fullest extent, while Hugh Tarpaulin stood down so as to bring his nose up to the level of the table, and spreading out a palm upon either knee, burst into a long, loud, and obstreperous roar of very ill-timed and immoderate laughter. Without having taken offense at behavior so excessively rude, The tall president smiled very graciously upon the intruder, nodded to them in a dignified manner with his head of sable plumes, and arising, took each by an arm and led them to a seat which some others of the company had placed in the meantime for their accommodation. Legs, to all his offered not the slightest resistance, but sat down at his directed, while the gallant Hugh, removing his coffin trestle from its station near the head of the table to the vicinity of the little consumptive lady in the winding sheet, plumped down by her side of high glee, and the pouring of a skull of red wine quaffed it to the better acquaintance. But it was this presumption, and stiff gentleman in the coffin seemed exceedingly nettled, and serious consequences might have ensued, but not the president, rapping upon the table with the truncheon, diverted the attention of all the present to the following speech. It becomes our duty upon the present happy occasion, avast there, interrupted Legs, looking very serious, avast there a bit, I say, and I tell us who ye dwell ye all are, and what business ye have here, rigged off like the foul fiends, and the swelling of snug blues ruin stowed away in the winter by my honest shipmate, Will Wimple, the undertaker, and this unpardonable piece of ill breeding. All the original company half started to their feet and uttered the same rapid succession of wild fiendish shrieks which had before caught the attention of the seamen. The president, however, was the first to recover his composure, and at length turned to Legs with dignity and recompensed. Most willingly, we will gratify any reasonable curiosity on the part of guests so illustrious, unbidden though they be. Know that they in their dominions, I am monarch, and am here to rule with undivided empire under the title of King Pest the First. This apartment, which you no doubt profanely suppose to be the shop of Will Wimple, the undertaker, a man with whom we know not, and whose plebeian appellation have never before this night thwarted our royal ears. This apartment, I say, is the dais chamber of our palace, devoted to the councils of our kingdom and to other sacred and lofty purposes. This noble lady who sits opposite is Queen Pest, our serene consort. The other exalted personages upon you behold are all of our family, and wear the insignia of the blood royal upon the respective titles of His Grace the Archduke Pestiferous, His Grace the Duke Pestilential, His Grace the Duke Tempest, and Her Highness the Archduchess Anapest. In regards, continued he, your demand of the business upon which we sit here in council, we might be pardoned for replying that it was concerns and concerns alone of our private and regal interest. It is in no matter important to any other than ourselves, but in consideration to those rights in which as guests and strangers you may feel yourselves entitled, we will have furthermore explained that we are here this night prepared to do deep research and accurate investigation, to examine, analyze, and thoroughly determine an indefinable spirit, the incomprehensible qualities and nature of those inestimable treasures of the palate, the wines, alices, and liqueurs of the goodly metropolis, and by doing so to advance no more our own designs than the true welfare of the unearthly sovereign whose reign is over all us and whose dominions are unlimited, and whose name is Death, whose name is Davy Jones, ejaculated Tarpaulin, helping the lady by his side to a skull of liquor and pouring out a second for himself. Profane varlet, said the president, now turning his attention to the worthy Hugh, profane and execrable wretch. We have said that in consideration of those rights which in the filthy person we feel no inclination to violate, we have condensed what makes to thee thy rude and unreasonable inquiries. We nevertheless, for your unhallowed intrusion upon our counsels, believe it our duty to mulct thee and thy companion in each gallon of black strap, having imbibed which into the prosperity of our kingdom at a single draught, and upon your bended knees ye shall be forthwith free either to proceed upon your way or remain and be admitted to the privileges of our table according to your respective and individual pleasures. It would be a matter of utterly impossibility, replied Legs, whom the assumptions and dignity of King Pest I have evidently inspired with the feelings of respect, and who arose and stated himself by the table as he spoke. It would please your majesty to be a matter of utter impossibility to stow away in my hold for even 1/4 a part of the same liquor that your majesty has just mentioned, to say nothing of the stuff placed on board in the forenoon by way of ballast, and by not to mention the various ales and liqueurs shipped that evening at various seaports. I have at present a full cargo of humming stuff taken in and duly paid for at the sign of the Jolly Tar. You will, therefore, please your majesty, be so good as to take the will for the deed, and by no manner of means either can I or will I swallow another drop, at least of all a drop of that villainous bilge water that answers in the name of Blackstrap. Belay that, interrupted Tarpaulin, astonished no more at the length of his companion's speech than the nature of its refusal. Belay that, you lubber, and I say Legs, none of your pavlar. My hull is still light, although I confess you yourself seem to be a little top-heavy, and as for the matter of your share of the cargo, why, rather than raise a squall, I would find stowage room for it myself. But this proceeding, imposed the president, is by no means in accordance with the terms of the mulcet or sentence, which is in its nature median, and not to be allowed or recalled. The conditions which have imposed must be fulfilled to the letter, and without a moment's hesitation, in failure of which fulfillment we decree that you do here be tied neck and heels together and duly drowned as rebels in yon hogshead of October beer. A sentence, a rigor and just sentence, a glorious decree, a most worthy and upright and holy condemnation, shouted the Pest family all together. The king elevated his forehead into innumerable wrinkles. The gouty little old man puffed a little pair of bellows. The lady of the whining cheat waved her nose to and fro. The gentleman of the cotton drawers picked up his ears. She of the shroud grasped like a dying fish. He of the coffin looked stiff and rolled his eyes. Chuckled Tarpaulin, without heeding the general excitation. I was saying, and said he, I was saying when Mr. King Pest poked in his marlin spike, that as for the matter of 2 or 3 gallons more of less of black strap, it is a trifle to a tight sea boat like myself, not overstowed, but when it comes to drinking the health of the devil and going down upon the marrow bones to his ill-favored majesty there, whom I know as well as I know myself to be a sinner and to be nobody in the whole world but Tim Hurley-Gurley, the stage player, why, it's quite another guess sort of thing, and utterly and altogether past my comprehension. He was not allowed to finish his speech in tranquility. At the name of Tim Hurley-Gurley, the whole assembly leaped from their seats. Treason, shouted the Majesty King Pest I. Treason, said the little man with the gout. Treason, screamed the Archduchess Anna Pest. Treason, muttered the gentleman with his jaws tied up. Treason, growled he of the coffin. Treason, treason, shrieked the Majesty of the Mouth, and seizing by the hinder part of the breeches the unfortunate Tarpaulin, who had just commenced pouring out of himself a skull of liquor, she lifted him high into the air and let him fall without ceremony into the huge open puncheon of the beloved ale, bobbing up and down for a few seconds like an apple in a bowl of toddy. He at length finally disappeared amid the whirlpool of foam, which in an already effervescent liquor had struggled easily, succeeding in creating. Not tamely, however, did the tall seaman behold the discomfiture of his companion. Jostling King Pest through the open trap, the valiant Legs slammed the door down upon him with an oath and strode toward the center of the room. Here, tearing down the skeleton, which swung over the table, and laid it about him with so much energy, goodwill, that in the last glimpse of light, died away with the apartment, he succeeded in knocking out the brains of the little gentleman with the gout, rushing them with all his force against the fatal hedgehogs full of October ale, and huge tarpaulin had rolled it over and over in an instant. Out poured a deluge of liquor, so fierce, so impetuous, so overwhelming that the room was flooded from wall to wall. The loaded table was overturned. The trestles were thrown up their backs, and the tub of punch into the fireplace, and the ladies into hysterics. Piles of death furniture floundered about. Jugs, pitchers, and carboys mingled promiscuously in the melee. The wicker flagons encountered desperately with bottles of junk. The man with the horrors was drowned upon the spot. The little stiff gentleman floated off in his coffin, and the victorious leg, seizing by the waist the fat lady in the shroud, rushed out with her into the street and made a beer line for the free and easy, followed under easy sail by the redoubtable Hugh Tarpaulin, who, having seized 3 or 4 times, panted and puffed after him with the Archduchess and a Pest. That leads us to the end of King Pest, which leaves us tomorrow for Metzerstein, which I don't know what it's about. But if you enjoyed King Pest today, please like and subscribe and share, and have a nice day.